Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading property experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, and Ben Kingsley, Chair of Property Investment Professionals of Australia, and the 2014 and 2015 Property Investment Advisor of the Year.
Alright folks, you're on the Property Couch, where each week Ben and I give you the insider's guide to property investing. Hello mate, how you going?
Good buddy, yourself?
Very good. Now this week we've got a very special guest.
We do.
Chris Gray, who we've known for some time. He's a friend of the couch, and he's agreed to come on the couch and chat about his own portfolio. Hello Chris.
Good to see you guys. Always a pleasure to be in Melbourne.
It's good to have you. You don't step out sort of west of Randwick very often, do you?
No. Well, Mount Street Coogee actually, but I come back to Melbourne just to remind myself of the UK, the cold weather, kind of the dampness, and
what
all that
about
kind
the
of
culture?
stuff.
Don't you come down here to get a bit of culture?
Oh, there's plenty of culture in Melbourne. Yeah.
you were here a couple of weeks back for the Grand Prix, weren't you?
Yeah. No, Grand Prix was good fun. Can't remember much, but apparently I had a good time. I checked myself on Facebook the next day, and it was all good.
Tagged you.
Yeah.
Very good. So Ben wrote an article recently for the cover story for the Money magazine on rentvesting, and that's something you know a lot about, isn't it? Because it's your personal philosophy.
Yeah, so I think the word rentvesting actually came from the Telegraph when we were doing the Property Expo.
Yep.
So one of the PR agents was putting it out there, and I thought it's a classic word, and I reckon it's going to get out there now.
Yeah, I agree.
So the whole idea on rentvesting is rent where you can afford to live, or where you want to live, and then go and invest somewhere else.
Yep.
Because for the majority of people, whether you earn $100,000 or $1 million, most people can't afford to live in the house that they want to live in.
Yep.
And so that's the thing is go and rent it, because quite often renting's pretty cheap. The yields, once you get on like $2 or $3 million homes, it's maybe 1 or 2% yield. Whereas if you go and buy $500,000 or $1 million apartments, like medium price apartments in the right areas, because there's lots of demand, you get 4 or 5% yield.
So have you ever lived in your own home in the last sort of 10, 20 years, or is it always...
No, not in the last probably 15 years. So I started buying my own places, then I'd renovate them, and then rather than sell them, then I'd just refinance and then just buy another one. And then I was living in one of mine in Tamarama, I think, in 2000, and we spoke to a property manager and we got a really good rent for it. And so we thought, let's go out and we'll rent another place. And we moved into a place called Gordons Bay, which is between Coogee and Bondi in the eastern suburbs in Sydney. And we were renting a $1.5 million 2-level kind of townhouse right on the water, so you could literally smell the ocean.
Wow.
And we were paying $620 a week, which is like 2% yield.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I think we stayed there for maybe 5 years or something, even until I got married. And I think the most the rent went up to was maybe $650. Mm-hmm. It's gold.
Yeah.
And really, I live in $5 or $6 million homes now. I think, value for money, I should have stayed in that $1.5 million one.
At the percentage, it was probably less than 1.5% at that time, or maybe even 1% yield.
But I think with the wife and kids and the rest of it, then we need a bit more space and stuff like that. So unfortunately, I had to move out.
Well, do you get any pressure from your wife to touch her own four walls, or does she see the bigger picture that you do?
No, she's pretty cool. That's probably why the reason I married her. So she likes change. She was a property investor, so she had a couple of properties before we got married, and so she just got into that thing. And so again, we hang around normal people. Like, we're not super wealthy or anything like that. Obviously, we're doing okay, but obviously we can live in a better house than most of our friends because we rent, rather than a lot of them. They'll be in a $1.5 million home, which, say in the eastern suburbs in Sydney, gets you nothing. It's like a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment.
Yeah, one of the case studies I wrote about in the magazine was the decision on, say, a 950 current owner-occupied home moving to a 1.6, so stepping up in grade, stepping up in location. What's the better option? Do we go off and then get a $1.3 million mortgage against that $1.6 million property, which we pay with after-tax dollars, and it's non-deductible?
And it's a lot of pressure to sleep at night owing over $1 million on your home.
And, you're paying that after-tax, so it's like just killing you. And instead of doing that, we basically decided to rent in that location and buy 2 extra investment properties. And we did the modelling, and I think it was about $1.1 million difference over 20 years in terms of financial benefit through rentvesting.
Yeah. And it's amazing because so many people just have in their head that you've got to buy, and it's from society, it's from parents, following the sheep, following all the other people in the office. Yeah. That's what people do.
Yeah.
But as soon as you break out of that, it's like, who cares? But it's having the balls to, I think, stand up to not follow everyone else. And that's hard for most people. Because especially if you're not financially literate, it's hard to back it up saying, no, this is better.
Yeah.
Whereas obviously for us guys, because we talk about it all day, we can just rattle off a few numbers and say, look, it's rubbish, you need to rent.
So I take it then that you're hooked, you won't go back to living in your own digs?
No, I don't think so. So, look, I mean, there's definitely advantages of living in your own home, but we've moved home a lot, and I don't think we've ever found the perfect place. So we've been in massive houses when the kids were really, really young, and we've lived in literally a third of the house. So we've had 2 or 3 lounges, 2 or 3 dining rooms, we've had a bar, like an almost a separate kind of granny flat kind of thing. We just don't use it. It's a waste of time. Yeah. And everyone says you've got to live in a big house. But just the cleaning and like all of that kind of rubbish is just not worth it. So we've actually gone back. So we live in an apartment now.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd never live in an apartment. Like, why would you want a family in an apartment? But we're in a place called Darling Point in Sydney, which is maybe 10 minutes from the city.
Yeah.
So
Tough neighbourhood.
Tough neighbourhood, just down from Point Piper. So probably
terrible.
Maybe the only second most expensive place in the world, in Australia to live. And they call it Dying Point because the average age is about 60 or 70. And you know you're in a lift in Darling Point because there's a seats in there because the people are so old they can't actually go down without sitting down. So anyway, we're in Darling Point and we're in a completely round building, which is really weird. So if you like art or something like that, don't go and buy one of these because there's
nowhere to hang the thing on the wall.
So we've got 3, everyone gets a whole floor. And so you get 360-degree views around Sydney, which is absolutely amazing. Yeah. So the nearest building is probably North Sydney or the Harbour Bridge. It's like 2 or 3 k's away. Yeah. So the views are just fantastic. You're almost at helicopter level because it's Darling Point's on a hill.
Beautiful.
And we've got 4 bedrooms. Even the dining table, we use it like 2 times a year. So what's the point having a massive dining room and all of that kind of stuff? The kids, they've got kind of a pool downstairs. We've got beaches around us. And that's what I love about Australia is you don't need a big back garden because you've got the beach and the council looks after it for you, or the parks. So why have your own garden and look after it and pay for it? Just go outside. But my mum thinks we're abusing our kids. So she comes over from the UK. How can you be so nasty to your kids? It's not fair and the rest of it.
In an apartment.
Because they haven't got like a back garden, but who cares? Go down the lift.
I mean, you know, we're part of Asia and it's very common for people to be living in, you know, medium and high density stuff. So when you arrived in Australia, you're an accountant, a chartered accountant,
or CPA.
Yep, CPA. Yep. So you're working at, was it Deloitte's?
Yeah, so when I left the UK then, I was doing kind of telcos and stuff like that. Then I got into a .com in Australia. Then left that to go into recruiting, which I did in Deloitte's. And this is where I got a lot of learning because I interviewed about 10 CFOs or finance directors a week. So in 2 years I did 1,000 people. Yeah. And I knew they could all do their job. So we just talked about social stuff, money and kids and all that kind of stuff. And I realised that all of these people, they were working 60 or 70 hours a week. A lot of them were then competing against backpackers that were earning $30 an hour, and they couldn't understand it. But in the kind of pre-GFC, like lots of people didn't want to hire some stuffy old accountant that was going to cost them $200 or $300 grand. They'd rather have some young gun that they could train up that wasn't fixed mindset and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And I thought it's not a job for life, even being an accountant. And a lot of these people, they've got the kind of the wife at home, 2 kids at private school, they've got a massive mortgage, business class airfares to go overseas. They've got no money. The wife's almost divorced them because they work so hard. And I thought, this isn't what I aspire to live like.
So when was the light bulb moment? When did you work out that the best way to go and do property was?
Yeah, so it was literally that point. So those 2 years, then I interviewed those 1,000 people. And at the time I had 6 properties roughly worth about $3.5 million. The market was moving 20% a year in those days, like 2000, 2001 or something. And so I was making 600 grand a year, and that's tax-free because it was capital growth. Whereas at the same time I was earning 80 grand at Deloitte, which was 60 after tax. Now I'm not a great accountant, but I'm clever enough to realise 60 grand a year for working, 600 grand a year for doing nothing. I like that 600 grand.
Yeah.
And I was into Ferraris and boats and the rest of it, and I thought, I need more time to drive cars.
You like the boys with the toys?
Yeah. So, it's good fun.
I think you're a hedonist. I think your lifestyle is all about, having fun. But
people hate me. Yeah, but I can live with it.
I mean, you drive around in a car that's not standard issue, company issue, is it?
This is my best. My story. People get sick of me. Like I know they do. My stories sometimes start off good, but this one's gone like supersonic. So I did a show with Dale Beaumont, who you know from Business Blueprint, And I said a Lamborghini, which is what I drive, a very subtle bright purple one.
It's very subtle.
It was double bay orange, but I thought that was a bit too subtle for double bay, so I've turned it purple, chrome purple.
Yeah,
Have you painted it?
Yeah.
I know, I've
Those are
wrapped
the new
it, so it's gone chrome purple.
Okay. Yeah.
Very subtle.
I followed him once through the tunnel, through the Lane Cove tunnel, and I couldn't miss him. He was 2 kilometres in front of me.
And you couldn't hear yourself.
I was in North Sydney once doing some other work, and I could hear this car, and I'm like, what the hell is that? Just echoing through the chamber of the city.
There's Chris.
And then I turn around, there's Chris.
See, to me, it's all leverage, because it's like Tom Panos, who comes on my show, it says it's not about who you know, it's who knows you. And when I'm in town, everyone can hear on there. So, and I think it's the best car for a marriage. Because I say, honey, I'm never going to have an affair because I'll be the most stupid person because the whole world's going to know that I've got some chick in my car.
In fact, on that, I've actually seen you put a baby seat in the back of that car.
Yeah, I've got a baby seat in there as well.
I think only a baby would fit in the back seat.
No, actually, because it's one line of seat, so it's the front seat. But
that's right.
This is going off track. But I actually went to a restaurant for a meeting and met my wife there and some other people and offered her a lift back, as most husbands do. But I had the baby seat in the car and got nowhere to put it. So it was actually a booster seat by then. So she actually got in the booster seat in the front of the Lamborghini. And look, that's got to be good quality for your wife. Like if she's kind of 45, 46 and she can still get in the booster seat, it's not a bad thing.
Right.
I don't know if that's illegal.
We just lost all our female listeners. Sydney, you're a very strong proponent of buying in Sydney. Is your portfolio outside of Sydney?
Just Sydney and the UK.
Okay.
And so a lot of people talk about diversification versus specialization. And look, I believe that diversification is a good thing in financial planning, which obviously you guys are into. That's what people tell you. But at the same time, I think is if you know something very, very well and you know all the people in the market, I think there's an argument for specialization over diversification. And again, for all of us in our businesses, we know property markets, we can renovate, we've got all the trades, we can do all this stuff. So I think for me personally, to be in Sydney is not a bad thing. But look, for a lot of other people, then I'd say, look, diversification is not a bad thing.
So in terms of how do you then talk to your clients about cycles in the market and the fact that, so are you sort of just get in and stay in for the long term, or do you talk about, look, we might be buying at a higher end, but that's okay if we've got a long-term view? You know, it's the long-term trend that we're interested in.
Yes. So look, most of the clients follow exactly what I do.
Yep.
And that's how my whole business started, that I was teaching people. So when I retired from work at 31, everyone said, like, how do you do it? And so I just told them the story. And because I didn't sell anything, I didn't have a job, then they believed what I said because I had no reason to put them down another path. I've always been, I'm not trying to buy thinking it's going to move up next year or the year after. I'm buying for 30 years.
Yeah.
So now the equation is you buy $1 million 2-bedroom now in Sydney, will it be $2 million at some point in the future, which I believe it will be.
Yep.
And so I don't care about cycles and the rest of it because, again, I'm not trying to push the limits because I think when you start pushing it, that's when people go wrong because they're taking too much risk.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't happen, you don't get the growth and they're screwed. And so I just think whether it happens this year, next year, the year after, I don't care.
On risk profiling, how would you class yourself as a risk taker? Would you say you're high or moderate to high?
Yeah, this is funny. I mean, I think I'm really conservative.
Yeah. But
In my purple Lambo. And so, because I'm an accountant, I know my numbers inside out.
Yeah.
I know as long as the property market moves 1 to 3%, I'm going to make money. So at the moment, my portfolio is about 15 million.
Yeah.
It costs me at the moment on current interest rates about minus 100 grand.
Yeah.
So as long as the market moves like 0.6%, I make money.
Yeah.
And even if interest rates, like in my book, I've looked back at it and the interest rates I work out was 7, 8 and 9%. So people say, oh, interest rates can rise, but I was paying 10% before and I was making money.
Yeah.
So I don't mind. So I just think your rent is roughly about 4.5%. Your net yield will then be, say, 3.5%. Interest rates call it 7 or 8%. So you're dropping 3 or 4%, which is 2 or 3% after tax. And that's all I think of. As long as you've got the buffer to support it, then that's fine.
And so you use what we call a break-even calculator.
Yeah.
So what we might do is actually put that up on the podcast website, thepropertycouch.com.au, because it's a great little one to sort of build comfort around that. Because as you say, you think you're a conservative, but the reality is, you're doing developments, you're now stepping up the grade of activity that you do.
Yeah, most of it though, we say we're more major renovators rather than developers.
Yeah.
So we're not buying sites hoping we're going to get a DA.
Yeah.
We're buying sites that if we do nothing,
They're
it's
gonna
great.
be okay. Yep.
Yeah.
But you're adding value to them.
But if we can render the block, we can add extra levels. The rest of it, it's all low risk kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing versus a developer that's punting that he's going to get a DA.
Yeah.
What's your message to a first-time investor who doesn't, say, have your appetite for risk, where they don't want to get into a lot of debt? Because, the ATO, the most recent stats we can get says that 73% of all property investors stop at one. And then there's a small minority that do multiple. So, because your philosophy is largely around using debt to service debt. Would that be right?
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say, say round numbers, say you buy $1 million property. At the moment, that's assuming you borrow 100% of the funds, which obviously a first timer can't do, but let's just assume that you can, or 105%. It's going to cost you about 10 grand a year. But I think over time it will cost you maybe 20 grand a year with interest rates. So my thought is if you buy a business, you need working capital to fund it for the first few years. The same as with property. So rather than borrow $1 million to borrow $1 million property, I'd say borrow 1.1, because you're going to have 50 grand of costs, 5% for costs, and I say borrow another 50 grand. And now, look, the only way you're going to be able to do that is if you've got equity in another property, or you borrow money from parents, or you put cash in, and the cash has got an opportunity cost. So if you've got that extra 50 grand, you can then self-service for the next 5 years, losing 10 grand a year. I think that's much safer than the person that borrows just $1.05 million, has got no cash, loses their job, and they're screwed. They have to force to sell a property and rebuy back. It might cost them 100 or 200 grand. So this is a classic thing where society says to get into debt is bad. But I think if you've borrowed an extra 50 grand and you've got comfort for 5 years that your property self-cash flows, to me, that's not more risk. And this is the thing where I think I'm conservative. So where I borrow that extra 50, to me that's conservative, good investing, versus the person that scrimps and saves and then has got no cash because they overborrow.
Yeah, we call it buffering. So we have a buffer, and that's so you don't want to gear yourself too aggressively. Where if something does go wrong, so what we do is we say, look, here's 5 years, 10 years. As an absolute minimum, we'll do 12 months. Just to sort of say, right, okay, so you've been made redundant or you've had a job change. So at that point in time, you don't have to panic and you don't have to rush sell. Because you're right, you can't go back to the lender and say, oh, I'm in a bit of a pickle. I just need a little bit of cash just to get me through this little bit. You might as well get it up front and keep it there for a rainy day. Hopefully you never have to draw on it. Hopefully everything goes well in terms of what the investment strategy plays out.
So that's exactly what I've done now. So I think I'm on stage 2 of property investing. So my whole idea is I wasn't worried about net equity. I wanted to get up to a certain level, say $10 or $15 million. So my portfolio has just gone up $2.5 million. I've borrowed 80%, so roughly 1.7. And then depending on my property, I've put 50 to 100 grand against every single property to then cash flow the difference for the future. And then I've got a lump sum that I can use for working capital in my business or me personally. So I could have taken that 1.7 and bought another $8 million worth of property and had 23 million. But my thought is, look, I have a good life and I enjoy things, but I'd rather have 15 million of property with a massive cash buffer than have 23 million. Because I've got nothing to prove to people. And if it rises at 10% a year, sure, at the moment I make 1.5 million versus 2.3 million. But I'm not going to live in a bigger house, I'm not going to have a better car, all that kind of stuff. So it's greed is the thing that can really screw you.
Correct, because it's like a house of cards. Once you get that sort of type of leverage position, it'll just knock itself over because you're chasing each other's stuff. I mean, we've got to feel for those people who bought out in the mining areas and that type of thing. Classic case in point where they've gone out and spent $450,000 on buying the property, and then the next thing you know, their property's now worth $200,000 and they're in negative equity. Now we're trying to, they come to us and say, what can you do? Well, if there's no other equity elsewhere, it is a house of cards. If we sell that one, we've got to still pay the bank back the difference. And so, it can destroy strategy. So what I like about what you're doing is you're basically saying that I'm still going to stick to blue chip areas, so you're not going to be aggressive in terms of the areas that you're looking at proven locations to a point where I was speaking to I had a radio interview about the Money Minute article and what actually was being discussed. He said, I've got friends in New York and they all rent. And everyone goes, and everyone just accepts that you rent in New York. And I was saying, it's a point, and this sort of rent vesting story is changing now. Like, Sydney and Melbourne are becoming international cities. On the grand scale of things, they're in the top 100 cities in the world. So they are becoming mega cities, and we've got another 1.6, 1.7 million coming into Sydney by 2028, and in Melbourne around 1.8, 1.9 million people. So on the grand scheme of things, they are good cities long term to invest in. We obviously invest elsewhere, but that's probably a timing play because we think our research is telling us we can pick up a bit of instant equity in these other areas which can leverage us back into. But of course, we'd love to have, if we're building a portfolio of 4 or 5 properties for our clients, we'd love to have one of them in obviously Sydney or Melbourne as a minimum.
So what does drive you then? You said you're not proving anything. It sounds like the portfolio is sustainable. What keeps you buying more?
So nothing necessarily. I go through phases of buying because, as you know, like the capital growth is lumpy, and so you don't pull any out for a few years. So my thought is I've got a reasonable buffer there, but I almost want another 10 or 20% growth in the market to then pull out another few million to literally sit on maybe 2 to 5 million of cash or just sitting in offset account. I just want to sleep. Because I've been in debt since I was 18, so I'm 44 now, so it's like 26 years of debt and sleepless nights. Because we talk about these stories and it's all fun and look, we make lots of money, but we all know that behind the scenes, it's tough. And it's not always that rosy.
Yep.
And you get down to your last $10 and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
So I'm just sick of being, I guess, reliant on the banks.
Yep.
So I want to get across maybe 10 or 15 different banks, have plenty of cash in the bank, not to have to worry. And then I'll almost be cash neutral then because I'll be about 50% geared. And sure, I'll start buying. So I think the market, sure, I should buy now because I can make more money, but there's no point forcing it. I'd rather keep the buffer in a way.
Now, in terms of the end game, are you planning to sell some of those down to retire debt, or are you going to continue to just live off that passive rent roll that comes through?
So I'm not looking at selling because as soon as you sell, then your asset base is less. So say I've got 15 million now, roughly 10 million of debt. If I don't really increase my debt now and it roughly stays similar, because for my business, I really just do my business for a bit of cash flow, services the mortgages. If that roughly pays my living, then that's great. So say 15 million doubles to 30 million in the next 7 or 10, 12 years. Then I'm like 30 million with 10 million of debt, which is 30% geared, which is positive cash flow.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's by the time I'm, say, early 50s. By then I'm 60, 30 million doubles to 60 million. Whether I've got 10, 15, 20 million debt, who cares?
Yeah.
And that's assuming I don't buy another single property, which in reality I will.
Yeah.
So that to me, that's not a bad game plan.
Oh, and effectively we're doing it, but not on that grander scale.
Yeah.
Like, obviously when we're dealing with mum and dad investors and who may have, sort of moderate sort of risk profiles and their circumstances. You obviously earn a good income. So, that it's all relative to income.
Yeah.
And so for say a nurse and a teacher, as that sort of entry level type investor, that's the sweet spot to help them get to that next stage, which, they just might want to replace their income. So they just might want to live on $100,000. In your case, it was very clear that you want the toys, you want the experiences, and you're living that sort of higher end of life. And so you've gone and created that to give you that opportunity, but obviously other people have different goals and dreams.
Yeah, but again, one of the other shows that I did with Dale Beaumont was talking about how to have the $1 million lifestyle without having the $1 million income.
Yep.
And that's the thing, because I still drive a 10-year-old car.
Yep.
So I still
it just
live
happens to be a Lamborghini.
Yeah, but and actually this is what we were talking about before. So the show with Dale, we said a Lamborghini is cheaper than a BMW. And so the thought process behind it was, my car used to be 750 grand brand new.
Yeah.
It's now 250. That's what I bought it for 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So I said my car's almost fully depreciated. So in the last 3 years, it's gone down 10 grand a year. So it's now worth 220. Whereas a BMW, you buy a brand new BMW, which lots of real estate agents do, or a Mercedes, and in 3 years, 250 will go down to 125. So it's costing you 4 times the amount in depreciation.
Yep.
So we did that story. And then 2 weeks later, I was talking to someone in the Lambo club, and he said, oh no, your car's gone up. Like, they're really rare these days, and they've probably gone up 100, 150 grand.
Classic story for scarcity. So, and it's turning that point. So it's basically become a collector's item now, and so it's turned the corner, which is, we talk a lot about scarcity when it comes to property. In terms of the scarcer the asset is, the more opportunity there is for strong demand, limited supply, and that's where we see growth.
Yeah. So I didn't believe him, so I rang the insurance company because on your insurance you've got a agreed value.
Yeah.
And I rang them and I thought they were going to tell me to get stuffed. And they rang back 2 days later and said, 350, fine. So I've made 100 grand on my car. So it's 33 grand a year. Even if you take off my interest costs, my servicing and the rest of it, I've made money. So what do? I go to my wife and I say, I should have bought 3, honey. I should have bought 3 different colours. I'd made 300 grand.
What about when you take the insurance premium off the bottom line though?
No, because these cars, like, no one steals a 10-year-old Lambo, especially if it's got your empire down the side and my phone number and my name. And so you think if they're going to export it and sell it to someone else, they're going to pick an easier car. So I reckon it's unstealable.
Yeah, good point.
You hinted before about your business. You're the CEO of your empire. You're also the host of your Property Empire on Sky Business News. We'll put the details on our website later.
Yeah.
What sort of properties are you targeting now in the current Sydney market?
So look, we don't change. So my strategy is the same 10 years ago as it was 20 years ago. And in my book, I literally haven't changed a word since 2008. The only thing we've changed in the book is the examples we used to put in there were 500 grand. Now it's $1 million. And at the time, everyone said, our property's not going to double every 7 years. Yeah, whatever. Well, that's kind of the proof in the pudding. But look, we typically avoid CBDs, because we say there's no limit of supply and there's a limit of demand of who wants to live in the CBD. So typically we're going 3 to 15 k's from the city. So it's where there's 3-story height limits. There's lots of demand from young professional people that earn 100 grand in the city and have got suits and wealthy parents. And so the thought process is if you've got limited supply and massive demand, no matter what happens in the economy, prices go up. And this isn't my words, this is words from like John Edwards from Residex, RP Data, all of those kind of clever people and economists in the bank, they're the ones that say it. So where people argue saying our wages aren't keeping up with inflation, sure they're not, and Australia and London and everywhere else have got affordability problems, but not in the good areas, not in Bondi Beach, where you can pay 10 or 15 million for an apartment. $1 million is cheapest house in the street. But you go down to Adelaide and you say, right, we're spending $1 million, and they say, well, we've only spent 400 grand on our home. People can't understand it, but in the local area, that's cheap and affordable.
Yeah,
it's all relative too, because if you do a fly around the world, you see, I mean, my wife's uncle, he's got a couple of apartments in Beijing, and he's got a 4-bedroom apartment in Beijing, I think, which he was telling me was worth just over 2.8 million US. Now, Beijing is, the CBD of Beijing is 100 kilometres squared. It is an enormous centre of population. I think there's 30 million people or thereabouts, 25 to 30 million people who live in Beijing. So it's all relative. Hong Kong, you just do a fly around. London, all of the sort of centres of commerce and these, sort of high-end cities, they're expensive. And I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon.
Our Property Couch community, Chris, is for people who've never invested before to people like yourself who've got multiple properties. What mistakes, looking back, did you make that you wouldn't make sort of in 2016?
Yeah, look, I don't necessarily believe in kind of the word mistake. It's all kind of learning. I think the worst thing that I've done was I was investing with a friend of my flatmates in the UK, so we had to buy a new property. And we were going to buy something in Sydney, but we couldn't buy new. It was only second hand, so we went to Queensland. And we picked an area. It was one of these house and land package, and I won't mention the seminar company that I bought it through. But their whole philosophy is land appreciates, buildings depreciate. So we bought in a place called Algester, which was about 20, 30 k's from the CBD, which made sense and all that kind of stuff.
Area and there's going to be a shopping centre here one day.
All of that kind of stuff. So look, we bought a property for roughly 300 grand. We sold it after 7 years, and I don't normally sell, but the other guy wanted to get out, and I didn't want to put the cash in to buy a share out. So it went from 300 to 450. So we made 50%. It's not the end of the world. But if I put the money in Sydney, I would have doubled the money based on my other properties. So again, I don't mind that because of learning. Sure, I'm still making money. Sure, there's an opportunity cost. I could have made more. But at least I didn't go buy 10 or 20 because I've heard a lot of people have done that. They've just ploughed a whole stack of money into one person's philosophy. 10 years later, the opportunity cost is massive. So at least I learned my lesson on that one. And it's like doing off the plan. I tried off the plan. Didn't necessarily work for me, so I haven't done any more of it. Oh,
and there's stories of, I've come across some fact finds recently where a particular person has bought 3 in one building, off the plan, and you're like, wow, like if this tanks this really tank, So they're dangerous.
So I did off the plan in just before the GFC.
Yep.
I bought a couple of units, and we bought kind of 6 out of a block of 30. It was like 200 metres from Maroubra Beach, so it's like classic thing.
Yeah.
80 square metre one bedders, like 55 internal, 25 outside, north facing with parking.
Yeah.
Cracking things for under 500 grand.
Yeah.
Now, coming into the GFC, it was maybe they're worth maybe 525, 550, maybe 600. So I made a bit of money on them.
Yeah.
But to buy 2 of them, I then had to put 20% deposits, so 250 grand down. I didn't want to do that in the middle of the start of the GFC. I wanted cash. So luckily I managed to sell them. So I had a great experience. I bought great units that rose in value, but it just shows you don't know what life's going to be like in 2 years' time.
Yeah.
And so I didn't settle on them.
Yeah.
But you imagine if they'd gone down 100 grand.
Yeah. Well, which is what's happening. I mean, if you ask any conveyancer and you say, what are the properties that, undervalue at settlement? They've just got and also, so what percentage? I'm like 10, 15%. I was speaking to one in Melbourne, which is 30% of all off the plan files I handle value under at completion. And you're just like, wow.
Have you seen any roadkill in your time? Have you seen someone where you've just gone, wow, how did they get into that position?
Look, I've seen, say, some of the mining town people, and where they've been to seminars, they were getting like 20, 25% kind of rental yields and stuff like that. And look, a lot of people come to me, like I'm sure they come to you guys saying, what seminar should I go to? And I say, look, go to every seminar. If someone's just come out of jail, go to a seminar, find out what he was doing
and don't do it.
to learn the stuff, or learn how he was ripping people off, or playing with valuations and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
but
go to them, just don't sign anything on the day. That's the big message, because that's what they do. They're trying to rope you into a position of hype and shortcomings, and they say this thing's worth $9,000, but today you can have it for $3,800, all that sort.
But I think part of it's the people have got to take responsibility as well.
I agree.
Because sure, I don't agree with people ripping people off.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the reason people have gone into that versus doing our kind of strategies is they want to get rich quick.
Yeah.
And they want the extra money. They want it nice and easy. You give them 20 steps. So when I was mentoring people, you'd give them 20 steps. They do step 1, step 20. Yeah. They just wouldn't do all the in-between ones.
Yeah.
And we say, like, we get a full valuation, $550, building inspection $440, and strata $250. So we spend $1,250 before we buy any unit.
Yep.
All we do is buy 2-bedroom units in the same suburbs. Do you think we know what we're doing? Yeah, we still spend $1,250. Would the clients do it? No, because they're too clever. They know more than us. And so some people you just can't teach.
So that 20 steps, do you still use that, or is that something you've got? It's a question on the spot, but do you reckon we can put that on the website?
Oh, look, I'm just saying it's more if you've got 20
I'm with you now.
20 steps and stuff like that.
The 5-step process they do.
But I can probably create 20. I'll do 34 if you want. But look, my golden one is get a valuation.
Yes.
No matter who you buy it through, if you get a full valuation, not a $50 on the internet, $500 or $600 full valuation where the value actually goes and sees the property and compares it to other ones, it's almost impossible, I think, to get screwed if you've got a full valuation.
Yeah. So that's a good tip. So as we close out, is there a couple of others that you always say fundamentals in your philosophy?
Yeah, I think going blue chip. Look, you pay more money to get into it. You're not going to get it cheap. So I'm paying full price for my properties, but I'm not paying 10% premium. So to us, to get 10% off, it's just we're not paying 10% premium.
Yeah.
But if you do that kind of stuff, then it's reasonably safe. And it's slow and steady wins the race all the time.
Yeah.
But you've got to do it. So I think for the majority of people, they just don't do it. They're trying to get high capital growth, high rental yields, easy to borrow, easy to buy, find property. You're never going to get all those 5 things. So there's always something like, people are worried now about negative gearing coming out. If they wait for that to kind of pass over, then they're going to be worried because interest rates are going to rise at some point. So then that's going to be the excuse. Yeah. So everyone's got an excuse. You've just got to do something.
You remember back just before the GST was introduced, most properties were positive cash flow back then. And then when someone was, when the GST, they dropped the tax rates, people were $10 a week out of pocket. And they thought property investing is never going to go forward. And of course everyone does. As soon as you're uncomfortable in your seat, you shuffle to get more comfortable. That's what everyone does. So, very good, mate. So,
thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me in Melbourne.
Yeah. Well, last question. Absolutely never going to invest in Melbourne at all, even though it's the other big international city in Australia. You just stick to your knitting.
Yeah, because I mean, my thought is normally I'd go Sydney, then Melbourne, then Brisbane, then Perth. Because my thought is Sydney is kind of the most landlocked in a way, and the most industry supporting it. But look, there's a good argument to say Melbourne's exactly the same, so I'd almost put them at the same kind of thing.
But you're living and
But then you
breathing
look at Brisbane and Perth, because if mining suddenly changes, people in Bondi, they've got no idea. It doesn't make any difference. Whereas if you're in Perth, you're going to know about it.
Absolutely.
Similar things for Brisbane as well.
Yeah.
Very good. There you go, folks. We've been listening to Chris Gray, the CEO of Your Empire and the host of Your Property Empire on Sky Business News. And mate, you may or may not know this, but every week Ben signs off in a different language around the country, and the listeners get to this point around the world. That's right. Get to this point to see.
And do one of the listeners from those countries then phone in and
Yeah,
say,
you just
someone's given
butchered
a wrong
that.
list,
Yeah.
and he's told us something completely different.
Well, they usually tell me that I turn everything into an Australian version of whatever sign off it is. But
I mean, it's a Google this, so I've got to try and sort of work it out. So we're Lithuanian.
Lithuanian
today.
Do you know any languages?
I don't. I'm Lithuanian. I don't know if I even know any Lithuanian people.
Yeah, no, there you go. Is this still a country? It's still one nationality. All right, here we go. So it's Viso Gerol.
Viso Gerol.
Viso Gerol.
Right?
Hey, you want to have a go at it? So,
No, I actually think that's pretty good. Viso. Oh, you're going for a nice, easy one.
oh no, I sort of safe bet today.
Monday morning.
But I'm running out of good ones. That's a challenge.
All right, folks. Until next week, Viso Gerol.
Viso Gerol.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks a lot. See you guys.